Welcome back, everyone. This is Mike from Nonprofit Productive, and we have a fantastic guest with us today. She is Martine Ellis. You've probably seen her website. Maybe you subscribe to her subscription service. Maybe you've listened to her podcast, but she has a very unique perspective on productivity. And I really enjoy finding folks out there who are thoughtful and trying to help you get more done, but for the right reasons and in a way that kind of fits for you. So, Martine, thank you so much for being our guest. And what would you like to add to that intro?
Mike, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. What to add to that intro? It sounded really impressive, actually. So I had a moment of, are you talking about me? Yes, you are. So yeah, I come from Guernsey. I live in Guernsey in the Channel Islands. And do you know, I was on another call earlier today, and the person didn't know where Guernsey was. So I'm just going to qualify that quickly. No, it's totally fine. I'm very used to it. So Guernsey is a very small island in the English Channel. So we're just kind of sandwiched between the UK and France, basically. Very small population, small community, but we're on UK time, so we were able to get time zones sorted, which was great. So I'm a writer and an educator. So I guess writing is my hobby / business / side hustle, and my day job is working in education, although those two things cross over quite often, as I'm sure you can imagine, working in the sectors that you do. But yeah, I'm a full-time educator. I work in the further education sector in Guernsey, and for those that aren't sort of on the UK kind of education system, that's where our vocational education takes place. So the kind of everything from trades to business to all sorts. So I work in that sector as a middle leader. I'm responsible for professional development of my colleagues. I'm also a teacher educator, and it's kind of, I guess it's a second career for me in many ways. We might dig into that in a bit, but yeah, I've been doing that for 14 years. I love education, I love teaching, but I also love writing, and that's why I do it so much, so often, and I'm all over Twitter. You can't get me off that place.
You're excellent on Twitter, no question about it. And if you want to know how to do connected threads on Twitter, just follow Martine, because you do it really, really well.
I do love a thread.
We love a good thread. I know we're going to be talking about well-being-driven productivity. I had to practice that a few times, but I want to start, Martine, with what's the opposite of that? And maybe that's a little bit of your origin story of, are we talking toxic productivity? I mean, what's kind of the ugly, bad side of productivity that eventually brought you to well-being-driven productivity?
I think it's always good to start with the bad stuff, isn't it? And actually, you're quite right. The opposite of well-being driven productivity is, in many ways, toxic productivity. It is hustle culture. It's workaholism. And you know what? In my previous career, I was in finance. I was a senior leader in finance for many, many years. You'd have thought that it was that made me start thinking, oh, I need to prioritize my well-being in order to do the best work and be the best person. But actually, honestly, when I was working in finance, I thought I worked really hard, and I thought I had a really tough job, and I was a director. I had my sports car and my really high salary, and it was lovely. I didn't know I was born. When I moved into education as an unqualified lecturer, I have never worked so hard in my entire life. So actually, the point that I realized that I got burnt out, for starters, so that made me go, okay, hang on a sec. I love working in education. It's an amazing career, but in order to carry on working in education, I need to do things differently. Because what happened was, going from that senior leadership role to being an unqualified lecturer, I don't know if my boundaries were any good in the first place, but I was working at the weekends. I was I was thinking about work all the time. I was marking in the evenings. I had so much to learn and so much to do that work became my life, and I got very unwell. There's an underlying thing here as well that I also at the time didn't realize, that I'm autistic. So I was doing this massive change, and autistic people as a rule don't like change generally. So I was managing that without knowing about it, but also getting really burnt out. I wanted to carry on in education, so I had to make some changes. So that type of productivity that I just described, working all of those hours, not having any boundaries, that's really the opposite of well-being driven productivity.
I was talking to some educational leaders yesterday, and was thinking back to when I was a classroom teacher with middle school and high
You
school
understand.
students, and I described it as like running a newspaper every day. Where I'd finish the day exhausted at say 3 o'clock, and then I'd say, "Oh my gosh, I have to do this again all over, and it's got to be actually good." And I've got to do it 5 or 6 times tomorrow and the day after and the day after. And
Exactly.
just that volume of creativity and designing and planning, it is really all consuming. So I can relate to that on many levels. Give us the elevator pitch for well-being driven productivity. How's this unique? How's this special?
It recognizes that, based on the experience that I've described to you, in order to do well, whether that's professionally or as a parent or in any context, in order to do well, you have to be well. If you are not feeling good, if you are, working loads and not getting a lot of sleep and eating junk food all day long because that's all you've got the energy to put in your body at the end of the day, if you're doing all of those things, you can't turn up as the best version of yourself in the thing that you want to be perfect at or brilliant at. Maybe not perfect, no one's perfect. So you have to put your needs first. And this is a bit of a shocking notion, especially for people who work in caring professions such as healthcare or education or in various sort of non-profit situations. You're ultimately going to be a very caring individual. And as a teacher, my job description basically says you have to put the needs of other people before you. But it's never going to work. And when I got burnt out, I really had a bit of a rude awakening. And I was like, no, hang on. I need to prioritize myself and my needs before I can do anything for anyone else. And so that's what well-being driven productivity is. You still want to be great at your job or your whatever your role in life is and be efficient and get lots done. But actually, you've got to start with yourself. You've got to start with your needs, and mine were quite complex. I didn't know at the time, but they were. You've got to prioritize rest, well-being, everything there first, and then you can get stuff done. And I like a productivity tool and technique as much as the next person, as you know. That comes into it too, but you got to look after you first.
Why do we put so much guilt on ourselves for not doing that? Why are we so bad at it in these caring professions, counseling, teaching, whatever, that we just say, no, I just got to power through. I can't take a personal day. Why are we so bad at that?
I think there's a lot of reasons, and sometimes it will come down to individual personalities, but ultimately the culture in the organizations that we work for, if they can make a shift towards getting people to look after themselves first, then we'll be better at that. If the organization is encouraging you to take breaks and to not work past sort of 6 o'clock and to not send and receive emails at the weekends and things, if the culture is right, we are going to get better at that. The trouble is, I'm a relatively small cog in a relatively big machine in my day job. So therefore, I kind of recognize I've got more control over my behavior than the others around me and the larger, wider machine, because I work for our government. It's a big machine. Well, comparatively, we're a tiny island. But, you've got to start with yourself and then maybe start influencing a few other people around you. And that's one of the reasons I write about well-being driven productivity, because it's my own. I'm definitely not an influencer by any productivity influencer. That would be great on my CV. I'm not that at all. But if I can get one person to go, actually, you know what, I'm going to take breaks today and see how that feels, I've won.
That's pretty good stuff. Yeah, I think I think there's a call for supervisors and managers also to demonstrate this by taking their vacations, by 100%. Acknowledging that they aren't perfect or that they're having a bad day. I think just being a little bit more human to the supervisors out there, because we don't usually say it, but we do watch those who are quote unquote above us, and we kind of take cues from them. And so if they're never taking vacation, it's sending a subtle message that we shouldn't either. And that's not great. So I think you're right. there's a need to go first in this well-being driven productivity mindset, especially for managers and leaders.
Definitely.
I want to talk about some of these apps and processes because your newsletter is great at kind of highlighting these behind the scenes experiments. You're always tinkering. I know you used TickTick for a long time, and now you're shifting gears and all that. I guess, and we could certainly talk about those things, Martine, but talk about this idea of tinkering or experimenting with the tools we use and why that in itself could actually be helpful and a contributor to well-being driven productivity.
I think tools are so helpful. I mean, if I can delegate something to a tool and it saved me a bit of time, I'm going to do that. I mean, I don't want to send us down a rabbit hole here, but ChatGPT is a really classic example of a tool that I'm tinkering with currently that is saving me so much time. So that's how I look at the kind of tinkering experimentation, because I also have some people who ask me about the tools that I'm using. I do tinkering for myself and for them, and get a sense of what the decent tools are, and I get a lot of pleasure from it. But if we're not careful, that tinkering can become its own form of procrastination. So I kind of, if I'm playing with a tool, I put a bit of a time limit on it, and I don't kind of move tools regularly. It's something I try to avoid, but I still tinker. I'm a big believer in the tools come a bit later. What you have to suss out first is your system. Tools are the things that make the system come to life. So, things like when I'm learning how I sort of process the input that I'm reading or listening to, I have a whole process that goes through my personal knowledge management system. And the tools can change if I want them to, but the system doesn't. The system is still the same. And the same can be said for how you manage your tasks and how you manage your calendar. For example, I'm a big time blocker for, blocking breaks in my day and also all of the tasks I have to do and combining that with my meetings. I block out a lot of my working day. And ultimately, I could do that system or that approach on most calendars. It just so happens that I'm using Morgan at the moment because I really, really enjoy Morgan. And that was one I tinkered with and went, no, I'll have that. That's really good. So I think tinkering is fun. I really enjoy it. Got to be a bit careful that it doesn't turn into procrastination and that you actually get something done at some point. But always focus on the process, the procedure first. Design that, and then find the tools that let you bring that to life. That would be my suggestion for anyone who's thinking, oh, I need a process for something.
I like Morgan too, and Morgan has a great nonprofit discount for anybody out there who wants to try it out. As does Superhuman, by the way, which is an app that I use not all the time for email, but they have a very generous nonprofit discount. So these are really powerful tools that sometimes you just have to ask around. What do you like about Morgan besides that it's new and kind of fun?
I mean, obviously it's new and kind of fun. What I really like about Morgan is how it's got me into a really good habit with time blocking. The biggest thing for me, and potentially for others listening, if you're in the same boat that I'm in, where you have like a day job that perhaps runs on Microsoft, for example, but you run your business and your personal life in Google, which is what I do, Morgan brings your calendars together, which is magical for me, because suddenly what I'm dealing with is the whole of my life and my commitments on one virtual page, as opposed to having stuff scattered. So what it does is it reduces a lot of brain friction for me, because I can look at everything as a whole. Up until fairly recently, I desperately wanted to keep everything separate, and that was boundaries. That was all about me establishing boundaries. But ultimately, it's just me and I have these different facets to my life, and so actually being able to see them on one virtual page has been huge. And the fact that it combines calendars with tasks, meaning that I can sort of drop another tool potentially, that has been groundbreaking, because you got your calendar with all your commitments on it, you got your tasks, you pull your tasks into your calendar. If anyone's listening to the audio version, I'm gesticulating wildly at this point. It and like you said just a moment ago, their non-profit educator discount is really very generous. So that was appealing compared to the likes of other planner tools. It was really competitively priced. So yeah, it's a good tool.
Now, again, without going down a rabbit trail too much, I know you were using TickTick for a while, which is great in terms of time blocking also for folks who are interested in a similar resource. Are you still, or have you shifted to Todoist, or have you just put everything into Morgan now?
So everything is in Morgan right now, although I am taking advantage of a Todoist integration in Morgan for one really bizarre reason. The Todoist widget on iPhone is so good for quick capture. So I'm kind of quick capturing it, goes through Todoist, but then it goes straight into my Morgan. So I sort of feel like I'm only using Morgan, but I am making use of that little integration. I think Morgan have got big plans to develop the tool, and my hope is that I'll be able to just drop that Todoist bit and just focus entirely on Morgan. TickTick, I was, how long have I used I used TickTick for so long. I am still a massive, massive fan of TickTick. I think it's one of the best tools out there for task management. What it didn't quite do for me, which is something I didn't realise I wanted till quite recently, is that planner feel, that feel of everything is kind of calendar driven. So it prioritises tasks in its interface, even though it has a calendar, and that's kind of rare for these task management tools. Whereas Morgan is calendar first, and that, you know, I could have made TickTick work very similarly to Morgan, but it just felt a bit different for me. So TickTick is the tool that I recommend to anybody who asks me, I want a really simple, effective way to manage my tasks. I will send them to TickTick every time. It's brilliant.
It's a great tool. And for me, it helped me understand that time is not infinite. And even though I can create an infinite number of tasks, there really is only so much in terms of minutes and hours in a waking day and time that I have energy to do things.
Yes.
It's something that's certainly a work in progress for me and probably for others too. Let's talk about this sense of feeling behind or this sense of feeling overwhelmed. And I typically talk about feeling behind a little more than overwhelmed, just because I think overwhelm is something that I occasionally have, but feeling behind is something that I often have in terms of work in the nonprofit space that I'm in. What is something that someone can do in this upcoming week? Is it the capture habit, a la getting things done? Is it having a pad of paper with me everywhere I go? Is it time blocking? I mean, just give us one strategy that you just know for almost 100% of listeners, it's going to work.
Yeah, I'm going to cheat a little bit and I'm going to put two of those together because actually you're exactly on the right lines. I think one of the reasons people feel overwhelmed is because they've got too much stuff in their heads. There's just too much going on, too many thoughts. And so I sort of lean towards the David Allen getting things done, capture side of things. If you can empty that really busy head and get everything out on paper or virtual paper, whatever works for you, suddenly you're going to feel clearer. So if you were going to do just one thing, it would be empty your head of all the things. Because actually the minute you're not relying on your memory, you're freeing up so much cognitive space to actually deal with the problem that you've got, i.e. you've got too much in your head. Get it out on the paper or virtual paper, and then the next step for me would be prioritizing and then time blocking. So I've kind of given you three options in one, but the first would be capture, empty your head, just pull everything out.
Love it. I completely agree. Let's talk about this toxic productivity that sometimes does exist in workplace cultures, and those can be in the for-profit or nonprofit space. I think they all are susceptible to that, are vulnerable to it. I think, the temptation could be this sense of like, I can't do anything, this place stinks, or just, it's awful. I got to get out. And maybe people do need to leave and find, meaningful work somewhere else. But let's say they want to stay and they also have this sense that my workplace is kind of toxic. What do they do to that? Is it just a matter of starting with myself and trying to, practice what we've been talking about over the last 20 minutes? Or are there other things that they can do to influence their colleagues?
I think you always have to, unfortunately, start with yourself, unless you are a leader listening to this and you become aware through sort of observing and listening to your team that there is something amiss. If you're that in that space, talk to them, listen, and you are then able to influence and make change. Assuming you're not that person, you do have to start with yourself, because that's the only control that you have at this stage. And there are lots of things you can do to start putting yourself first, getting boundaries in place, and we can talk a bit about those. But the reason why I think bottom up as opposed to top down can work is because once you've started making some changes, other people will notice, and you might then have the opportunity to kind of share what you've been doing and why, and then that will hopefully spread. It's not, the fairy tale way that I'd like it to work. The way I would like it to work is that you actually are able to speak to your higher ups and say, look, there's a problem here, and they listen and they make all the changes, and everyone lives happily ever after. But if the reality is that's probably not what the workplace is going to be like. There are situations where sometimes that place isn't for you, and after a process you need to go. But hopefully, by putting some strategies in place, you can make things better for you, and then that can kind of flow out and affect other people. That's what I'd love to happen.
It's interesting, during COVID, the weird part of it, I think, for a lot of knowledge workers, at least, was that work and the rest of life kind of blurred. But I think in some ways that was fantastic, because it helps supervisors realize that you can still work from different places. And just because you have a dog or a cat running around behind you, or a toddler, or whatever it might be, you can actually still be productive. And those are important parts of your life. And, so your AC went, or there's something wrong with a member of your family or something like that. That's all part of your life, and just as important as work. And I think supervisors saw that maybe for the first time, which is kind of sad, but, and hopefully they get to a place where they say, Martine has a lot of interest in her life, and not just as an educator, and she has hobbies and friendships and whatever, and that's all part of who she is. And it's pretty great to acknowledge that. So
absolutely.
What's your take on, kind of post-pandemic? I say that sort of gently, are there some positives that supervisors and managers hopefully will come out of this pandemic with?
Yeah, I think in many respects what you describe, I've seen that as well. I've seen an increase in trust, trusting that if someone says they're going to work from home, they're actually working, and they're probably doing a lot more. My own personal experience was, for context, I don't have kids, so I kind of was in a privileged position. I've got an office, I was able to work quite comfortably from home, and I'm really mindful that other people didn't have necessarily that privilege to work from home in that way. But for me, it was incredibly positive. I was the experience of working from home actually led me to seek an autism diagnosis, because I was working from home and I was like, I can get so much done. I am so productive at home, yet I'm physically comfortable because I can wear what I want, and I can stand up and move around and go and hug my dog when I need to, and I can snack as often as I want. And working from home was an absolute dream for me. Not ideal when you're a teacher. I don't teach. I teach a couple of hours a week now, so that's why I was able to work from home so much. I didn't do much teaching online, but it was a revelation, and I've been able to keep that up a little bit. So for people like me, people who are autistic or neurodivergent, being able to be trusted by your employer to do that, to meet your needs, and ultimately for you to feel better as a result, and for you to work to produce even more work. I mean, that was a huge bonus, a huge win.
Our guest for today's show is Martine Ellis. She's a productivity expert. She's a writer and a podcaster and an educator. And Martine, I feel like we could talk for another 30 minutes, but I want to be mindful of your time as we're in two different parts of planet Earth. How can folks find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
Oh, thank you for asking. The easiest thing is to go to my website. So my website is martineellis.com, and there you'll find links to my podcast and my writing and stuff. Come and hang out with me on Twitter as well, because that's where the cool kids hang out, Mike, I think. So yeah, I'm Martine Guernsey on Twitter.
And we'll, of course, put links to all that in the show notes. Martine, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
I've really enjoyed it. Thanks, Mike.